Hello, welcome to the Trails Radio Show. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today, my special guest is Mr. Howard Byrne. Thank you, and join us in a minute. Okay, my first question to you is, how did you get started in your career? How did your career begin?
Oh, gosh. Well, you really have to start when you're talking about radio with all your influences when you were just a kid. And for me, it would go back to when I was probably 5 or 6 years old, down in the basement of my parents' house. My dad had this radio, this old radio. Well, it's old by today's standards. Probably wasn't that old back at the time, but it had AM and FM, and gosh, I even think it didn't have a world band, but it had another channel on it. But anyhow, and it had the speaker on the top of it. So the dial was on the side, and the speaker was on the top, and I used to just sit down in the basement, just loving listening to the radio. And I grew up in Detroit, and so in Detroit, we were lucky enough, not only did we have, the Golden Tower of the Fisher Building, but we had some excellent rock stations, and we also had Canadian radio stations from Windsor, Ontario, like CKLW was a big powerhouse radio station, AM 800. And so there were just so many influences on the radio. But as I was growing up and getting into maybe 10, 12 years old, by that time it was just cracking from the late 70s and the disco era into the early 80s when new wave music and what we now call the revitalization of power pop with bands from Detroit like the Romantics becoming international success. And there was a radio station called WABX in Detroit, 99.5 FM, and a morning show host who would become a legend. If Google search his name, Alan Stagg, he was a legend in Chicago radio, but he did spend some time in Detroit radio. And Alan Stagg was probably my biggest influence in radio, in that he did comedy skits, produced comedy skits based upon what the popular television series of the time were. So instead of Beverly Hillbillies, it was Bloomfield Hillbillies, and instead of Fantasy Island, it was Reality Island. And I used to sit there as a young teen, and I probably seen the old cassette recorder players that were basically just a box with a speaker, and there was a little built-in microphone, so you could dictate into them. And I would every time they hit a comedy skit or played a song that I just loved, I would click the record and play button and flip the cassette recorder upside down onto that speaker from the radio and record all those segments and all those bits, and a lot of that music that I would later on go and as I grew up and got money, I would buy on either vinyl or later on CD. That became the music of my youth. Yeah. And then I got into college, and with college, I started out in architecture school because first I wanted to become a boat designer and boat architect, but after I sort of figured out that there wasn't a college that really fit me around the area, I went into just regular architecture at the University of Detroit in architecture was going to be my stumbling block. I'm just not a mathematician.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I found the television radio, and I switched my sophomore year in college from architecture over to broadcast journalism, and there began my radio career. I graduated from college and started out at a small radio station in Ohio, and then moved to Traverse City, Michigan after that very, very long year in Ohio. And I've lived in Traverse City ever since, and spent the better part of 16 years at a powerhouse rock station called WKLT FM in Traverse City.
Yeah. What do you do for that station? Do you host a show?
One more time, excuse me.
For that station in Traverse City, Michigan, do you host that show?
Oh yeah. I'm fortunate. Every radio station that I went to, really only been at three in my entire lifetime. Was WVEX. I got hired there to host in the evenings, and that was what we would now call middle of the road music. So by today's standards, it would be considered like a light FM. But it had I was there for 5-6 hours in the evening. It started out the first 2 or 3 hours. I think I was the air personality disc jockey, and then we went to talk radio, and then I was just a board operator when we went to the talk radio shows of the time, which was Larry King and several of the syndicated talk hosts. And then when I left there, I spent all of about 2 months on my parents' couch sending out resume tapes, and landed the job in Traverse City, and started out doing evenings. Or actually, let's see, what did I started out as a part-timer doing weekends, and that very quickly turned from weekends to evenings or overnights. Overnights were interesting because you're always getting the night owls from society that are calling up, and you're like the only person they have to talk to is the disc jockey at the radio station. And but then of course you're also doing the pre-production, getting things ready for the morning show that would come in at 5 or 6 a.m. And of course the morning show people were always the best paid people at the radio station. And I did that for a while, and then I moved to doing evenings, 7 p.m. to midnight, and did that for about 7 years straight, 7 nights a week, doing evenings before there was a management change, and my on-air terrestrial radio career very quickly came to an end.
Yeah. Yeah, radio is difficult sometimes. It's a difficult industry to be in.
Yeah, it can be fickle. I mean, for some air personalities, you wind up having to go through format changes, and if you're a rock and roll radio guy, you might or you may not. It just depends, but you might not like it if the radio station switches over to country music, for instance. I was pretty lucky that I always got to work in the music format that I liked. I never had never had a problem with that. But management changes, those are usually just as difficult as music format changes. And when we went through a management change, they just wanted to go into a different direction. It had nothing to do with ratings. Because I always was lucky enough to enjoy very, very high ratings with my shows. But they wanted to go into a different stylistic. That was my cue sign to bow out.
Yeah, I started out in music radio, then I switched to talk radio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's I thought about doing talk radio, but but I had run out of things to say, quite honestly. At least it seems to be as though I would run out of things to say. Where music, I don't really have a hard time, talking about music. It's what I love, and I guess that's where I tie it all back into where it all started for me. Sitting in the basement listening to music on the radio is just a youngster, and I never knew what I was going to become, whether I was going to go into television I remember when I was just a kid, I would read the newspaper as if I was on a television set at the dining room table. I would set the newspaper out, and I would try my best. I didn't know back then that television people were looking into teleprompters that had everything they were saying right in front of their eyes. So here I was having to read a newspaper, but it got me really, really in tune. It really helped develop me. Just reading the newspaper aloud, and I think it really helped form what I would later, deal with in radio. Because in radio, you're reading little cue cards that have sponsorships on it, and any radio personality worth their salt can both ad-lib, but at the same time wants to write certain things down so they're saying it factually correct. So get good at reading news copy, but you also get good at just communicating very much in the same way that we are right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun to be in radio. It's challenging, but if you truly love it, you'll stick with it.
As you should. I mean, the one thing about radio is it was never obviously about the money. And if it's not about the money, you better do it for the love of it. The idea that you have something to share. But that's also one of the tricks of radio too. And one thing that you always see with brand new people on the radio or on television is they get caught up with the idea that they're talking to thousands, if not tens of thousands or more of people, when really you should focus on you're having a conversation just like you and I are having a conversation. You always have to think of it as you're really only having a conversation with one person. And if you talk, whether it's introducing music or whether you're doing a radio interview with somebody,